Back in the civil rights movement, the silence of the church spoke volumes. And in the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement, the silence of the church still speaks volumes. That's the black historical reference from Martin Luther King. Martin Niemöller, the German, put it this way: 70 years ago in 1946, when the Nazis were in power in Germany, Niemöller talks about the danger of silence and not speaking up in his quote, which has become famous now. First, he says, they came for the communists, but I was not a communist, so I did not speak up. I was silent. Then they came for the socialists, but I was not a socialist, so I did not speak up. I was silent. Then they came for the trade unionists, but I was not a trade unionist, so I did not speak up. I was silent. Then they came for the Jews, but I was not a Jew, so I did not speak up. I was silent. Then they came, Father Mike, for the Catholics, but I was a Protestant, so I did not speak up. I was silent. Then they came for me, and by that time no one was left to speak up. Ecclesiastes 3:7 says there's a time to be silent and a time to speak. Speak up! The church is silent about a racist megalomaniac running for the presidency. A megalomaniac who's sweeping Republican primary after Republican primary because he is saying publicly what millions of white Republicans and 100 black preachers are thinking, feeling, and been saying privately, not since 2008, but since the South lost the Civil War. And some would say since the Europeans stole this country from the real Native Americans, not the European immigrants who call themselves the folk who want to take our country back and make America great again. Yeah, great. The great land thieves, the great body stealers, the great slave traders, the great slave holders, the greatest hypocrites, the greatest liars, and the greatest racists on the face of the planet. And in the face of an on-rushing locomotive, with the emphasis in that word on L-O-C-O, loco. Cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, loco. Like a deer trapped in the headlights of an 18-wheeler, the church is appallingly silent. Janelle says, silence is our enemy. Sound is our weapon. Speak up. Hell you talking about? The misogyny coming out of the mouth of that megalomaniac millionaire is matched only by the racism that seeps out of the slimy pores that he has dredged up from the swamps of trailer trash. Politicians who pander to the fears of white folk have a special place reserved in the deepest pits of hell. And the church, the good people, need to break their silence and say something. In the war against evil, silence is the enemy's strongest ally. Hell you talking about? Janelle Monáe says, silence is our enemy. I travel over 100,000 miles a year preaching, teaching, listening, and learning. And in over 50 different airports in this nation, I've seen a sign posted by the Department of Homeland Security. My time is up. But what the sign says is what I want to leave with you on this Good Friday. The sign says, if you see something, say something. Hell you talking about? If you see what violence is doing to our community, if you see what violence is doing in our community, speak up, break the silence, say something. If you see what our government policies are doing in this city, in this state, do you know that in the state of Illinois, the Jewish Zionist State of Israel lobby, the same folk that met last week in AIPAC, have tricked the state legislature in the passing of law that anybody, any business that engages in boycott, divestment, or sanction, the same thing we did to end apartheid in South Africa, that business is going to be punished. And the folk in Springfield didn't even know what they were voting on. If you see what our government is doing in this country with voter suppression, if you see what the government is doing, if you see what it's doing in public policy, in foreign policy, $3.5 billion given to Israel for military. We got money for military and money for war and no money for education. If you see what the government policies are doing, speak up, break the silence, say something. Hell you talking about? You are the church. Don't be in the crowd that just stands by watching. If you see something, say something. And we learned 2 years ago at the Proctor Conference, once you see something, you can't unsee what you've seen. Hell you talking about?
In a plea bargain. And here we have this humble carpenter, this rabbi, this peasant from the backwoods, this this Jew, Palestinian Jew from Northeast Africa, who refuses to defend himself on trial before Pontius Pilate. And Pilate still cannot find a reason to execute Jesus. He's still trying to find a way to squirrel out of executing an innocent man. But because Jesus won't cooperate, Pilate retreats to a place of political expediency and decides that he'll fall back on a Roman custom. He knows that it's the custom of releasing a prisoner at Passover. And so even though he doesn't have the courage, y'all ain't saying nothing, to set Jesus free, he figures that somebody in the crowd will have sense enough not to choose an insurrectionist over Jesus. He has the hope that some of the spectators who have gathered, some of the folk that ate the fishes and the loaves and the fish sandwiches and drank the red Kool-Aid, somebody that got free health care, y'all ain't talking, somebody will speak up for Jesus out of the crowd. But instead they call for Barabbas. The Barabbas who was an insurrectionist, the Barabbas who was guilty of murder, the Barabbas who was a notorious prisoner, the Barabbas who was on trial. Everybody knew that Barabbas was guilty, but mobocracy ruled. And so to satisfy the crowd in an act of expediency, after attempting to recuse himself from a verdict that he didn't want to give, Pilate shifts his responsibility from himself to the crowd. The tragedy of this text is that the crowd doesn't choose Jesus, but they choose Barabbas. And not only do they choose Barabbas, but they choose crucifixion for Jesus. Pilate acquiesces to injustice and refuses to risk anything for another. He's the type of leader or the type of person that's a calmer chameleon. He's like the person that constantly keeps his finger in the wind, trying to see which way the wind is blowing. Okay, I see y'all don't get it. He's the kind of person that'll sit up in a church meeting and won't say a word in the meeting. But then when the meeting is over, he gets on the parking lot. Y'all ain't gonna talk. And tells everybody, well, you know, I really was in favor of that, but I didn't want to say nothing because I didn't want to be the only one that stood up. Come on here. He's the one that will come to a meeting and won't say anything, but then go back and tell everybody what he thought should have been done, because he's always looking to see which way the wind is blowing. He only wanted to satisfy the crowd who had been stirred into a frenzy by a right-wing moral majority who had tried Jesus on trumped-up charges. They cried blasphemy. And they really didn't care anything about blasphemy. They cared about power. They cared about a shifting of the paradigm. And Pilate, I have to give him credit. Even though he came up with the wrong answer, he did ask the right question. But this text also shows us that we're still living in times where people still choose Barabbas. Give us Barabbas and we'll gut the Voting Rights Act. Give us Barabbas and we'll still fight against gun control in the name of the First Amendment freedom. Give us Barabbas in spite of the fact that people are dying in the street with their hands lifted up in the air and they are unarmed. And then we go before a grand jury and nobody goes to jail. They eat a pizza, drink a drink, and go back to their home, their hotel room. Give us Barabbas. Give us the racist misogynist that talks about what they do to women behind closed doors. Give us Barabbas. Give us lies and deception and Twitter tirades at 3 o'clock in the morning. Give us economic inequality. Give us unrestrained greed. Give us lies and duplicity and espionage and sabotage. Give us WikiLeaks and give us the release of emails that the Russian government is tampering around with. Give us Barabbas. Why would the crowd demand such a horrible fate for somebody like Jesus? The irony of the fact that they chose Barabbas instead of Jesus is that they like Jesus because of his popularity. Jesus is targeted because he's popular. He's targeted because of his influence. But the same crowd that cried Hosanna, some of the same Negroes, excuse me, I thought I was at home. Touch your neighbor and say, Negroes will let you, they'll throw you under the bus. Some of the same folk that were hollering Hosanna, some of the same folk that were waving palm leaves on Palm Sunday are some of the same folk in the crowd that got the free health care and the fish sandwiches and the red drink and the free benefits. They are now saying crucify him. They are stirred into a frenzy, willing to believe the worst about the best, because passion can override judgment. Look at somebody and say, she got that right.
America made a choice. It should be said that half of American eligible voters chose not to choose. And that's a choice. They chose to sit it out. And choices, all choices, have consequences. Last Tuesday was much more than an election. It was about the soul and the character of a nation. Unlike any election in recent memory, we were being asked, what kind of country do you want to be? And of those who did vote, a little less than half chose the man who now dons the title I'll get there eventually. So here we are. We have gone from the first black president to a president who ran on a white nationalist platform and rode in on a wave of racial resentments and fear and bigotry and very real economic anxiety felt across races from the Rust Belt to the South. He rode that wave all the way to the White House, told folk that the country is in a mess and I'm the only one who can fix it. And I wondered to myself, when I heard him say that, I wonder what God Almighty in glory was thinking when he heard a mere mortal say that you're in a mess and I'm the only one who can fix it. Here we are. And somehow the serious contest for leader of the free world was transformed into a reality television show. And many of those who are wringing their hands this morning, their hands are dirty. Because the truth be told, the media did the American people a terrible disservice this election cycle. Driven by greed, driven by ratings at any cost, they allowed this to be turned into a television reality show. And so while you might be shocked this morning, you really ought not be surprised that the person who knows most about how a television reality show works actually won. If you think about it, the outcome is not surprising at all. What are we to say about these things? And so I didn't come this morning with any easy answers. I didn't come this morning to sugarcoat this thing. I believe in God and I believe in the power of God, but I didn't come this morning to rush and say to you that God is in control. Because sometimes when Christians say God is in control, it is a way of absolving themselves of responsibility. God is in control of all things, but in God's infinite wisdom and power, God has left us in control of some things. And while we're looking up to God, God is looking down at us, asking, what in the world did you do with the power that I already gave you? And so what shall we say about these things? And I've come to say this morning that we've got some work to do. And the first thing we've got to do is we've got to be honest about these things. We've got to be honest about that thing called racism. Racism, America's original sin, and its most intractable social evil. Racism, that demon that rears its ugly head. Racism, that virus, every time we think we have it conquered and we've come up with an inoculation, it mutates. It showed up first as slavery, and when slavery ended, it became a new kind of re-enslavement. According to Douglas Blackman's, Jim Crow segregation was a slavery worse than slavery. And then when we got through Jim Crow, we saw the new Jim Crow. Racism, it manages to mutate. It is a virus. It is stubborn. It is hard to get rid of it. And every now and then when the country finds itself in a tight situation, there are those who try to ride the wave to power by appealing to the demons in our nature. And so when Mr. Obama was elected to the presidency of the United States, it was a proud moment for America. And there were those who in the midst of their excitement, in the midst of the euphoria, began to proclaim prematurely that we are now living in a post-racial society. But how quickly did we learn that we are not living in a post-racial society? Matter of fact, because we had elected a black man to the White House, it seemed to give some permission to become more racist than they had ever been. And all of a sudden, we began to hear things and see things that we had not seen before. I shall never forget listening to this dignified man give the State of the Union address and have a sitting congressman of the United States of America stand up and yell, "You lie." When have we seen that kind of insult and vitriol? And no shame, actually raise money on racial epithets. And then the one who the other night won the beauty contest. We can't forget that he rose to political prominence by trafficking a racial trope that questioned the legitimacy of the current occupant of the White House. And they can't use that ugly N-word, but we're not so sure about his birth certificate. We're not so sure where he's from. We know what that's about. That's dog whistle politics. He's not one of us. And pretty soon, the dog whistle, as this election cycle ensued, the dog whistle turned into a scream. In fact, it became so loud that folk who had been previously engaged in the dog whistle got embarrassed. And they said, well, we didn't mean to be that crass and to be that crude. And they were worried about him. But he rode those racial resentments all the way to the White House. And the objects in our rearview mirror proved to be closer than they appeared. And so we got to deal with this thing. America, this ugly thing called racism. But we've also got to deal with this ugly thing called sexism. If we learned anything the other night, this country is every bit as sexist as it is racist. And brothers, you can't be mad now. You can't be mad about racism and sit on your hands when I start talking about sexism. There's no such thing as equal rights for some. There has to be equal rights for all. And thank God for our sisters who stood by us even when we did not stand up for them.
Now, I believe what we're seeing and what we're witnessing is the birth pains of a third reconstruction. Attempt to move this nation to a third reconstruction and attempt to hinder it. When you see a president run and his whole first speech is about racism and xenophobia and what white nationalists call the first battle, the battle against immigrants. When you see even the Supreme Court unleashing the opportunity for pornographic sums of money to be put into our political arena. When you see a general suggest that all that was needed was a little compromise to not have a civil war, and not understand that it was compromise that has led to the worst racism and worst genocide the world has ever seen. When you see a constant call for tax cuts and what Steve Bannon called destruction of the administrative states, when you see a goal of taking $1 trillion from Medicare, Medicaid, and cutting it, when you see the kind of attacks on voting rights, you are seeing the same, when all of that happens virtually at the same time, what you are seeing is an effort to deconstruct the possibility of reconstruction. And why is there such a fear? It's not just because Obama got elected, but because the demographics are changing in the South and in the country. And we know now that if you just register 30% of the unregistered black voters in the South and you get them to vote along with progressive whites and Latinos, the South is no longer solid. And if you just break 4 states in the South, like North Carolina, say Georgia, Virginia, and Florida, then that whole block is over. And if that ever changes, then the extremists don't have a chance, particularly in national election. What we saw with the breaking through of President Obama in 2008, it wasn't about President Obama. It was the expanded electorate, black and white and young and others coming together. He basically got about the same percentage of the white vote as all other Democratic candidates, but it was an expansion of the vote. And when he won North Carolina, Florida, Virginia, in South Carolina, that was the first sign of an idea whose time has come. When he broke through, that is why we witness firsthand the white lash that America is reeling from right now. And people who sometimes say they disagree with Trump, no, they don't. They disagree with his antics. They do not disagree with his agenda. They disagree with the fact that he's putting out in the public discourse what is only supposed to be talked about behind the curtain. And you want, and the policy agenda of make it great again, and the policy agenda of white supremacy is pretty much the same thing, white nationalism. Somebody asked me the other day, they said, is Trump a white nationalist? I said, well, let's look at what white nationalists support. They said, well, is he a white nationalist in his heart? I said, I don't know what's in his heart, but I look at the heart of his policy. Jesus said, where your treasure is, that's where your heart is. Where your heart is, that's where your treasure is. That's how you determine racism. Racism isn't whether you got a black friend. Racism isn't whether or not you kissed a black baby at Houston at a hurricane shelter. In fact, you can be black and be a white nationalist. If you endorse the policies, and if you understand the racialized context of the policies. So what is the agenda? Here it is. Tax breaks to the corporations and to the wealthy and hurting the poor. Well, that's the same agenda as white nationalism. Attacking public education, that's the same agenda as white nationalism. Denying public access to health care, well, white nationalists don't believe in health care for everybody either. Attacking immigrants, white nationalists attack immigrants. Attacking the LGBT community, white nationalists attack the LGBT community in the name of religious liberty. Stripping environmental protection, well, most white nationalists believe in stripping environmental protection. Expanding the carrying of gun and military weapons, well, white nationalists believe in that. So you don't have to say you're a white nationalist. You can actually be against what happened in Charlottesville and against the death of Heather, against hate, and still be a white nationalist. Because you can be against personalized interpersonal hate, but you can support hateful, destructive public policy, which is really what white nationalism and white supremacy. So we need to have moral language. Moral language that says, how does this policy help the general welfare? How does this policy line up with our deepest moral religious values? There are 2,500 scriptures in the Bible that talk about the issue of poverty. Talk about how we treat the poor, how we treat the least of these, how we treat the hurt. There ain't but about 3 in the Bible that talk about homosexuality, and not one of them trumps the scripture. You still got to love your neighbor as yourself. It doesn't say your straight neighbor, your gay neighbor. It says your neighbor. So we have to challenge this Christian nationalism, this white evangelicalism that has told everybody that the way you know you're right in the public square is if you're for prayer in the school, if you're against gay people, if you're against abortion, and if you are pro-guns and tax cuts for the wealthy, and if you are trying to convince everybody that Jesus was an original member of the NRA. We need to challenge that foolishness. It doesn't line up with Orthodox Christianity, Islam, or Judaism. And we need to challenge it.